My name is Ronnie Green, and I have the pleasure and privilege of serving as the Vice Chancellor of the Institute of Ag and Natural Resources here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And we welcome you tonight to the Lead Center for the Performing Arts at the University of Nebraska for what we think is a once-in-a-lifetime event for those of us that are so close to agriculture and natural resources. All of this week, we have been celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Morrill Act that was established in 1862 under President Abraham Lincoln that enabled the building of the wonderful land-grant university system that we have had in this country for the last 150 years. That was an opportunity to open up education to people in the masses and to mechanize agriculture and to grow agriculture in ways that perhaps the founders then could not have envisioned that we've seen play out in these last 150 years. We thought it would be a milestone to mark that 150th anniversary to be able to engage in a dialogue not only about the past 150 years, but about the future and about the future needs in agriculture and feeding the world that lie ahead of us as we move out over the coming decades. So we are immensely pleased tonight in our first Heuermann Lecture of the season, and I'd like to, as we start tonight, to recognize the efforts that the Heuermann family, particularly Keith Heuermann and his wife Norma. Keith is with us tonight. We appreciate so much the opportunity to host this lecture series and their support in providing that for us. We have a tremendous opportunity tonight to hear from 4 former U.S. Secretaries of Agriculture, spanning the years 1981 through 2007 in their service in the highest leadership role for agriculture in the United States. So let me briefly introduce them to you. Our format tonight will be to get some opening comments from them first, and then we will go through a dialogue on a series of questions with them before opening it up to the floor. First, let me introduce to you John Block. To my left, John served as Secretary of Agriculture under President Reagan from 1981 to 1985. He is currently still involved in production agriculture in a deep way and has a weekly radio broadcast that he hosts around agriculture still currently. Seated beside John is Nebraska native Clayton Yeutter. We're blessed in Nebraska, being in the epicenter, many of us would say, of agriculture globally, to have had 4 U.S. Secretaries of Agriculture hail from our state, and Clayton was the 3rd one of those. We honored those 4 earlier today in a luncheon here on campus. Clayton is a native of Usda, Nebraska, served as U.S. Trade Representative under President Reagan and as U.S. Secretary of Agriculture under President Bush I from 1989 to 1991. Next to Clayton is Dan Glickman. Secretary Glickman served under President Clinton from 1995 to 2001, hails from the state of Kansas, where he represented Kansas in Congress for a number of years before becoming U.S. Secretary of Agriculture. We were joking with him earlier today. He says he's colorblind and didn't realize he had on that purple tie, but we'll excuse him for tonight.
It's red.
And of course, next to Dan is Senator Mike Johanns. We all know Senator Johanns well, currently serving as a U.S. Senator from Nebraska, former governor of our state. Grew up on a dairy farm, had an interesting conversation with he and his wife Stephanie at dinner tonight. Hails from a dairy farm in Iowa, and he's very proud of that fact. Served as Secretary of Agriculture under President George W. Bush from 2005 to 2007. And we're very pleased tonight to have joining us to moderate the discussion amongst the former secretaries, Jeff Rakes. Jeff also is a Nebraska native, hails from Ashland, Nebraska originally, up the road here from Lincoln. And one of the things that is interesting about Jeff and his history is his father, Ralph, was instrumental in the formation of what we now know today as the Institute of Ag and Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Jeff has an illustrious career with Microsoft and is now the CEO and Chief Executive Officer of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in Seattle. So Jeff, welcome. We'll look forward to the dialogue tonight with the former secretaries.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for attending tonight. This is a tremendous opportunity for all of us to tap into this brain trust. And while Ronnie and I will be moderating some discussion here, we also are looking forward to taking questions from the audience. And so I believe there's a procedure here where you have the opportunity to list out a question on a card, and we'll try and work that into the dialogue. Now, gentlemen, what I'll be doing is throwing out some questions to you, and we're not going to do round robin or anything. We'll make it very easy for you to kind of chime in where you'd like to chime in, but I thought it'd be very good for you to begin by maybe sharing some thoughts regarding this event and your views on agriculture, and we'll start with you, John.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Jeff. And first of all, I'm delighted, I'm honored to be here tonight, a chance to talk to this group, your great lecture, well-known and highly regarded, and with the other former secretaries of agriculture that I've worked with over the years and known for a long time. So I'm not going to say a lot because we're going to have a lot of discussion. I guess to start with, if you just look at the situation we're dealing with here in the United States and in the world, we're looking at maybe 2 billion more people by 2050. They got to be fed. Agriculture, you can say, well, what's important? You got to have food. And U.S. agriculture, we export a third of what we produce, roughly. And we need to be able to keep this up and keep increasing production. And I know you talked earlier about 150 years since Abraham Lincoln started the Department of Agriculture, land-grant universities, and we've done a wonderful job of moving forward with research and education. And we've managed to feed the United States and countries around the world. But we've got to continue to do this. And you don't do it unless you continue to focus on research and looking ahead. I guess that might be one of my first points. I don't think we're paying enough attention to research today. Maybe we will, especially if we don't have quite enough food or have another drought or two. But I think we've got to look at that. I think we've got to look at agriculture industry in the United States and make sure that it is appreciated and protected and given the chance to do what I know we can do in a free and open market system. But we have challenges. We've got animal rights people climbing down our throat, trying to tell us what to do, what not to do, how to raise our livestock. We've got government trying to regulate everything. Everything that crawls is going to be under regulation if we don't stand up and stop it. So these are challenges that we face. I think that beyond those kind of challenges, I know we'll talk about the Farm Bill. I will just tell you, in rural America, going back to the farm, coffee with the guys, others, the Farm Bill is important, but it is not as high a priority as a lot of these other things that I'm talking about now.
We got John on a roll already here. You can see what it's going to be like.
Yeah, I'm going to. Anyway, the last thing I would say, and it's not farm, just farm, but the debt that this country is looking at today, and you look around the world and you see Greece and you see Europe and the struggles they have, we don't want to go that route. And I know that's not the South 40 and it's not the cornfield, but let me tell you, it can impact all of our lives if we don't deal with that problem.
Great points, John. Thank you. Clayton.
Jeff, we should just all say amen to that and let everybody go home. At least I would say amen to that, that's for sure. Well, first of all, in my case, I have to say it's so wonderful to be back in Nebraska. This is home, always has been home, always will be home. So it's great to be back here. And I also wanted to say, on behalf of all of us Nebraskans who are sitting here, special thanks to Jack Block and Dan Glickman for making an effort to come out here and join us all in that program tonight. Except that if somebody in the audience would give me a scissors, I'll cut off that purple tie, and we'll take care of that little problem right now. Just a couple things to start off with, Jeff. I would say one is, as Jack indicated, we've got a challenge of feeding the world, as you know as well as anyone, Jeff. That means we've got to do everything better in the future. And so all of us who are involved in American agriculture in any way have just got to figure out how to do everything better than we do today in a sustainable way with less land devoted to agriculture than exists today. That's going to be a major challenge for all of us, and we can talk about that some more here tonight. But I'll give you one little anecdote that reflects that, and I'll talk about other things later then. But the anecdote which reflects the need for constantly improving our productivity and our efficiency comes from a meeting I attended in London a few years back. And it was a speech by the CEO of one of the largest chemical companies in the world. And I've always remembered it because what he said was that, he said, I'll be brash enough to say that I think I run the best, most productive, most efficient chemical company in the world. But, he said, I realize that every morning when I get up, I have to run faster than I did the day before. Yeah. And that's a pretty good illustration of what the kind of challenges we have in agriculture as well.
Totally agree. Thank you. Dan.
Well, first of all, Jeff, thank you, and Ronnie for inviting a Kansan. This is not a Kansas State University tie. I want you to know that I'm colorblind, folks. And also to J.B. Milliken for having us here at this fine school. I just make a couple of comments. Somewhere along the way, after I left USDA, I lost my way and went into the motion picture industry for a while. And there's a famous movie that many in the crowd, I'm sure, have seen. The movie is called The Graduate. And in that movie, Dustin Hoffman is a college graduate and doesn't quite know what to do. And his prospective father-in-law comes to him and he says one word. He says, there's one word. And then Dustin says, what is that? And he said, plastics. Remember that? Yeah. Okay. Well, actually, today the word is agriculture and food. Look at where we are economically. We have the highest farm income in history. We have the highest exports in history. We have the highest cash income in history. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't problems, there isn't a drought, and there aren't challenges, which there are. But I think what this recognizes is over the long term, agriculture and food is poised to be a very dominant industry in America, unlike where it's been in many years in the past. So I really think that's something that's exciting for anybody who's in this business. The second thing, you talked about the Morel Act, 1862. Imagine this. In the midst of the Civil War, in the midst when the country was being torn apart, the founding fathers, the members of Congress, and Abraham Lincoln, when the bullets were flying and the battles were being raged, passed this profound legislation, the Homestead Act. They passed the Morel Act. They passed the whole system to deal with the land-grant college. They changed America when times were really bad. It's a good lesson for us as Americans as we look at all of our problems today that we can work together to get things done, like my friend Mike Johanns does in the Senate today when he works on farm legislation. We don't have to be at our throats all the way. And the lesson of the 1862 law ought to be a good lesson for us in the year 2012.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm sure you'll get a lot of agreement from the audience on the importance. Mike.
Jeff, thank you. I think a perfect place to start tonight is with the Morel Act. It changed our nation, if you think about it. But I also think about Abraham Lincoln during that time, and Dan laid it out so well. Tough time in our nation's history. Our country was torn apart. But he had such confidence in the future of this country. And he passed this legislation, and it created the land-grant university system. But it also created the Extension Service. So the science that was taking place at our universities had a way of being applied, if you will, at the farm and the ranch level. But think about this. At the same time, the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, also encouraged and then signed a piece of legislation called the Homestead Act. And we recently celebrated the anniversary of the Homestead Act. Now, if you look around the world at that point in time, the model would have been that the government owned the land and that people lived on the land and served the government. Abraham Lincoln had a different vision for our nation. And that vision was that literally, if you wanted to go out and homestead, you could own that land. And it totally changed the United States. And it established in our country a free enterprise system. So as we talk tonight about agriculture and its future and where it's come from, I think one thing we need to keep in mind is that this vision of Abraham Lincoln, which created our free enterprise system really at the ground level, is a vision that we need to protect. It's a vision that we need to think about. When Jack talks about the regulations and the overpowering power of the federal government, it is just so important to keep in mind that we have to give the individual the ability to succeed and fail in our policies. And I think that's what brings us here tonight when you think about those important pieces of legislation.
Great. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Great opening comments. What we'll try and do now in the next, say, 45 minutes is to touch in a number of topical areas. The role of the land-grant institution, the role of production agriculture, both here in Nebraska, the U.S., and how it relates to the world, international trade, resource management. Some of you have mentioned the importance of some of the sustainability issues we have. And then also, I think maybe we kind of dive into the Farm Bill a little bit as a way to explore the role of public policy. Given that this celebration is about the Morel Act and the creation of land-grant institutions, I want to start there. And I'll begin by sharing a quote from President Lincoln, who once said that farmers, being the most numerous class, it follows that their interest is the largest interest. It also follows that that interest is most worthy of all to be cherished and cultivated, that if there be inevitable conflict between that interest and any other, that other should yield. We're in a different era. When President Lincoln said that, approximately 60% of the U.S. population was involved in agriculture. Of course, it's under 2% today. So think about the challenges that we face, the opportunities ahead. What is the nature of the American farmer's interest today, and how should we think of that in this global context that some of you have mentioned?
I'll take an immediate shot at it. Yeah, obviously, we're a pretty small segment of the population in this country today. And compared to the rest of the world, which is much more dependent, has agricultures that are much more populated by farmers than we are. It's a totally different situation here in the U.S. Than it is in other countries. And we have to adjust to that within the agricultural community because that has political consequences as well as economic ones. From an economic standpoint, what we've demonstrated is immense efficiency and productivity, the kind of thing I talked about just a minute ago, as we've grown larger through the years and have production plants in agriculture that are just mind-boggling today. I was over at the Farm Progress Show in Iowa here just 3-4 weeks ago. And I'm telling you, the machinery today, Jack, as compared to where it was when you and I were really active farming, is just unbelievable. But at any rate, what that means is that we have a totally different set of challenges today in the world as well as here in the United States. And we have to figure out, as a minority group that is really a minority group, how we achieve what needs to be achieved in the way of public policy, in the way of public-private cooperation, and in the way of getting done what needs to be done in an area like research if we're going to feed 9 billion people.
Go ahead, Dan.
Well, I was going to say that I think to a large extent the reason why we only have 2% of the people in agriculture is because agriculture is probably the most productive segment of society, and it's productive for a lot of reasons. One of them is because of the land-grant college system, research, education, extension over the years, where all the techniques have been learned and transferred to people to practice, and it's remarkable. The big challenge for the land-grant institutions is not to rest on the laurels, but to look at the challenges that are in the next 20 and 30, 40 years. What are those, what I call asteroids out there that could come in and really do us great harm? And that could be all the way from pests, disease of animals and plants. It could be water shortages. I'm just talking with Jeff and others, J.B. Milliken, about the Water for Food Institute here. It could be nutrition challenges, how to feed a hungry world. It could be sustainability challenges. How do you feed an extra 2 billion people and not rip up the earth in the process? So I guess my point is that I think the reason we got here was because of this great infrastructure of the land-grant college system, but in some sense the burden is on the system to produce over the next 20 or 30 years as well.
Great, and I think, thank you very much, Clayton and Dan, and I think Mike wants to jump in, and then I'm going to explore more deeply what the role of land-grant institutions should be.
Thank you, Jeff. I'd offer a thought about this. The numbers may be small, 2% of the population. Compare that to Lincoln's time, a completely different country than when Lincoln was president. But having said that, 2%, you think about that and say, how are you ever going to impact anything? But I would suggest that the potential for great influence by the farmer and rancher has never, ever been greater in the history of this country. We do have an increase in population headed our way, and it's in parts of the world where people are improving their economics. And increasing your daily income from $1 a day to $3 a day makes a world of difference. And what's the first thing that happens? They look to improve their diet, and especially in the area of protein. So you think about that, you think about the influence we can have in other areas like conservation, research, leading the way in technology worldwide, and our potential for influence and our potential for a state like Nebraska, because ag is our #1 industry, has just never been greater, and the future has never looked better.
Now, I think some very important points have been made here. I think it's important to distinguish between the percentage of the population that's involved in agriculture and the strategic importance, and I think that that's a key part of what Mike was saying. And I also think what Dan said about the important role in land-grant institutions actually making it possible for us to have this efficiency is extremely important. So now let's dive into land-grant institutions, which have been the epitome of public education, that now serve 4.3 million students nationwide and $34 billion in research, 2/3 of all federal research dollars. We're in tough economic times. We're in times where people are talking about ways to reduce the deficit, where to cut back, so on and so forth. I'd like to hear you dive in on this topic of what will be the role of the land-grant institution, the funding of the land-grant institution, and to the extent that they are going to play an important role going into the future. How do we ensure that they have the resources to be able to play this kind of role?
Well, as I said earlier, we need more research and education and try to deal with our challenges. Private research has been growing faster than public the last several years, and it actually exceeds the public research. But that doesn't say that we can't jack it up a little bit on the public side, and we should. We should do what we can there. I think the only way you're going to make progress on that front is take advantage of the fact that there is a lot of national concern about producing enough food. You know, the drought, that creates another, it's a challenge for us, it's a problem, but it also raises everybody's attention. That are we going to grow enough food? Can we have enough food? How do we feed everybody? How do we meet the challenges? And I think that right there can help give us some support among the general public. All this general public that don't know farming, they don't care about farming, but they really do care about having enough food. And I think that's our opportunity.
Right, Clayton.
Jeff, and this is for Vice Chancellor Green's benefit. I think colleges of agriculture in this country are going to have to be bold. And this is true in teaching, research, and extension programs. I'll talk more about the international stuff later. But when, we've got to have undergraduate teaching that is just first rate. Because those are the kids that are going to come along in dealing with all these issues over the next 25 or 30 years. We're going to be obsolete pretty darn quickly if we're not already obsolete. So no, we're not going to do this. So that's one. On the extension side, it seems to me we have to remember that has an important role. Extension has changed a lot. It's responsible for every one of us being up here on this stage here tonight. Today, it's a different kind of extension, but we still need it in a very significant way. I think it'd be a huge mistake to lose the advantages of that program, which are not duplicated effectively as well anywhere in the world. And then on the research side, Jack is right. And here's where some of the boldness comes in. Not everybody loves the idea of having public-private research combinations because the argument is, well, aren't you going to be selling your soul to the private sector? Isn't there a conflict of interest and so forth? Well, maybe there's some possibility in that. But the fact is, we have to get that done. And there will not be enough public resources with the kind of situation we had with a debt and deficit today to do this job as well as it needs to be done. So it's going to have to be done with private sector help.
Yeah, well, a couple of very important points made there. In particular, that last point about leverage, the ability to use the public sector dollars in combination with private sector dollars to magnify the research. But also, another point that Jack made that I think is really important is that part of making the case for the ongoing investment in research is the points about feeding the world and the challenge in doing that. I remember growing up and my father, Ralph, talking about how U.S. agriculture could feed the world. Mm-hmm. But that was a view of 30, 40 years from now. So now I ask you, can the U.S. through production states like Nebraska feed the world? Or if not, what is the responsibility that we have or the opportunity that we have for U.S. agricultural policy that balances the protections that we provide to farmers here and supports production capacity in the developing world? Mike.
I'd offer a couple of thoughts on that. Number one, Nebraska not only has the capacity to feed the world, so to speak, but it is doing it. If you think about our state, about a third of our production in many areas of agricultural production goes into the foreign marketplace. It is enormously important to us. It is not accidental that every governor in recent memory does trade missions. We're out there trying to sell our products, and agriculture is also a part of that. But Jeff raises a very important issue. Will it be sufficient for the United States, Nebraska included, to just focus on production capability and then literally ship the products to other parts of the world? Or is there going to be a greater demand than that? I have to tell you, having been all around the world, I think we all have many times, you begin to realize that there are parts of the world that they just would never relate to the kind of agriculture we have here. We're just so far ahead of where they're at, and yet those people need to eat. So you look at Africa and India and developing countries, and you begin to realize that you need to establish an opportunity to partnership with them and then give them the opportunity to grow crops. Some of the things that Jeff, your foundation is doing in Africa, and we were there recently, it's just remarkable. So I think it's a combination of things. I think it's a combination of, yes, let's do everything we can to keep our markets open, level the playing field, ramp up our production, do all the things that we can possibly do. But then I think we also have to recognize that we're going to have to ramp up what's going on in other parts of the world. And ladies and gentlemen, nothing will buy more goodwill for the United States of America than if you are there making a difference in Africa or India or many other countries that I could mention.
Jeff,
Can I
interject on this one?
Go ahead.
I'd be curious to hear from the secretaries on this point of feeding the world and focusing on production here in the U.S. We're all aware that over the last decade, let's say as a time frame, there's been growing interest in local food and the locavore movement, so to speak, or organic production, or alternative production systems to what we would have called conventional, 10 years ago. Can you talk to us about how much, I'm sitting here thinking about priorities as a person that's, leading an agricultural program at a land-grant university long-term. How do we balance that? Or what's your thoughts relative to that with the feeding the world question?
I think you're right to think about priorities, because you can't do everything. And the pressures, I'm sure, on a land-grant school, like they are in a lot of institutions, is do everything. And that's not possible to be done. But I do think that we have to recognize we're in a slightly different world in terms of consumers. It used to be that consumers didn't have a lot of role in deciding what they wanted to eat. You talked about that this morning. That's just changed dramatically. It's changed with attitudes changing. It's changed with new technologies. People want to know what it is they eat, what's in their food, where it's produced. And that's just a phenomenon that exists in the world. In the case of internationally, folks in sub-Saharan Africa, Tanzania, Malawi, Uganda, you name it, they want to be able to grow their own food. They don't want to have to just rely on our production all the time. And so we have to do it all, in the sense that we have to continue to produce enough food for ourselves and for export to keep American agriculture strong. But agriculture and people's diets are changing too, and agriculture has to change along with those things as well. I remember just one quick anecdote. When I was secretary, AID came to me, Agency for International Development. They wanted to provide aid for soybean production in Colombia as a way to maybe try to get them off of coca production. Now, soybeans would never be as profitable as cocaine, I don't think. Okay. But anyway, we thought it was a pretty good idea until a delegation of the American Soybean Association came to me and said, what do you want to be encouraging them to grow soybeans for in Colombia? And, and it was pretty, at that point in time, we didn't have a lot of clout to basically fight that. So we didn't do it very much. The fact of the matter is the world's changing. We are able to feed a lot of people in the world, but they want to feed themselves as well. They want our technical help, our technical expertise, but they want to do it on their own as well. And that's something, of course, the Gates Foundation has been very much involved with.
Yeah, I know both Clayton and Jack want to jump in, but I do want to emphasize that point. For countries to move out of extreme poverty, which is a huge advantage in terms of turning them into potential trade partners and a more secure world, you only get out of extreme poverty through improvements in agricultural productivity. Yes. You don't do it by just trying to ship in food aid. So, Jack, and then Clayton.
No, I would just follow up on this. If these countries want to improve their production, which you're saying, and they need to, they're not going to get it done unless they take advantage of all the new technology. New technology is genetic engineering. It is the right chemicals. It's doing everything right, like we do here in Nebraska and in Illinois. And I'm not saying that the organic farms aren't all right, but listen, they cannot compete. And all of the research says they may be 25% less productive than a modern agricultural production farm. And I think that I don't feel comfortable when they try to pretend like their food tastes better. I don't even believe that's nonsense. And I don't accept the suggestion that they can compete with the modern agriculture. They cannot compete with modern agriculture. And I don't like the idea that they are against genetic engineering. Look at what genetic engineering has done for us in this country. We're trying to feed a lot of people. And let's be honest about it. If you want to have an organic farm and charge an extra amount of money for it and make a lot of money, I'm all for that farmer. But I don't want to mislead the public in general, because I want the public to understand that the corn that comes off of my farm is as good as anybody else's.
Yeah, I think part of what you're saying is you don't want those people to impose their choices on others, and I think that's an important part of the issue. Clayton.
Well, just as a bit of a supplement to what Jack had to say, and I think Vice Chancellor Green, you don't want to get too far away from traditional agriculture as maybe Jack and I would define it here in Nebraska or anywhere else for that matter. None of us up here have any objection to people growing organic or buying organic, consumer choice.
Or the little family farms.
That's right, the locavore.
Local farms, fine.
Thing right on the edge of cities, that's fine too. And there can be some profitable operations there. But that's not the heart of American agriculture. It's not the heart of Nebraska agriculture. And in our lifetimes, it's never going to be.
Okay, except I don't want to take just slight disagreement with my colleagues, but I would say this.
Good, now we're getting into it.
I know it.
If you talk to most consumers in this country, and more care about what's in their food, which means is they want to have food that has less chemicals in it. They want to have food that they believe is healthy for them. It doesn't mean that they want to become hippies and vegetarian hippies of the 1960s, but it does mean that they care more about what's in their food and how it affects their children's health and their health as well. So, I would just say that modern agriculture is going to continue to feed most of the world, but it's also going to change itself. Too. It's not going to be like it was 40 years ago.
So continuous change. Mike, I know you wanted to draw.
Yeah, let me, I see the blue jackets in front, and these are young people that maybe are thinking about a future in agriculture, trying to figure out where they fit. Some are looking at the huge capital costs of getting into agriculture and saying, how can I ever overcome that? Let me offer a couple of thoughts about this, if I might. I think the desire by the American consumer to have a more specialized diet is not going to decrease, it's going to increase. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that I think you will see consumers who will want to go to a restaurant and look at the menu and say, oh my goodness, I can have a steak and it says it comes from the Dan Glickman farm in Kansas, and I know him to be an outstanding producer. That's the steak I want. Now, on the other hand, Mike Johanns would go into that restaurant and say, I want a steak, because I just believe American beef is going to be great.
And you don't buy steaks from guys with purple ties.
Yeah, I wouldn't buy it from a purple tie guy anyway.
But I'll look for other customers.
But here's what I would say to these young future farmers. Don't ever overlook the opportunity to participate in agriculture. You may look at that and say to yourself, you know, I'm going to have the highest technology to identify my animals and trace my beef and have the highest standards of production and feed quality and et cetera, and I'm going to market to this area because I think I can make money and do well there, and you know what? You very well could. Now, I'll also say this. If you're going to feed the world, and I believe that's what agriculture is about too, we have to recognize that you're going to need science, and you're going to need technology, and we're going to need the very, very best of the land-grant institutions to accomplish all that. Norman Borlaug, who I had such great respect for, passed away just a couple years ago, would always say, I am fine with the organics, I am fine with whatever size farm you want to be, but we need science to feed the world population, and it is so true.
I want to make sure the rest of the audience recognizes what Mike is saying. Can our FFA members stand up and be recognized as young people interested in agriculture? Great. Well, thank you. Now, one of the things that I think is a very interesting challenge is to consider some of the resource challenges we've talked about. In fact, I want to just share an anecdote that Dan had shared with all of us that I found quite stunning. If you think about the growth in population over the next 40 years, adding another 2 billion people, if you think about the changes in those diets in the developing world as they consume more protein, we're going to have to produce a lot more food, maybe 70% more agricultural output, maybe 100% more. Dan said that we're going to have to produce more food in the next 40 years, more agricultural output in the next 40 years than in the previous 8,000 years. That is a stunning statistic that really shows the challenge of population growth. Now let's think about it in the context of some of what Ronnie mentioned and Jack and Clayton as well. We have resource constraints, and one of the big ones is water. 70% of human consumption of water is via agriculture, and we're in an era where climate change is redistributing water. So I ask you, and now switching over to the resource management topic, what is your perspective on the role that land-grant institutions and the role that the public sector should play in taking on some of these resource management challenges, and in particular water? Jack?
Well, it's public and private, but we already have companies that are developing crops that require less water to raise a crop. It's genetic engineering again. I mean, you just got to recognize how important this is. If you don't adopt some of these modern technology, you're going to farm like they're farming in Africa now, where they're not raising, a third of a crop compared to us. So we've just got to take a look at that and move in that direction. That's the answer.
Well, it's a complicated problem because obviously new technologies will perhaps produce more drought-resistant crops or crops that will use different types of irrigation that won't require the same amount of water. In a couple of weeks at the World Food Prize, an Israeli scientist is winning the prize because he developed drip irrigation, which has changed the world in many cases, arid lands. But it's also resource management. It's the way farmers operate their whole farm systems, how they protect against runoff. It's a whole litany of things that needs to go into this equation. But water is the oil of the next century. And unless and by the way, I think it's the land-grant schools that are going to take the lead on this, because I think that finding drought-resistant crops is going to be a big part of the thing. But a lot of the private companies don't have it within their mandate or what they owe their shareholders to do the kind of research that needs to be done, the basic research to train scientists so they'll be able to study these problems over the long term. And so I think you guys are going to have to take the lead in this, at least in terms of how we manage our agricultural future.
Great. Well, Ronnie, as we said, it's about priorities. So you just heard priority.
Absolutely.
I know Clayton wants to chime in, and then Mike.
Jeff, you may not know this, but your dad and I worked on water issues here in Nebraska together way back when, maybe before most everybody in this audience was even born. But that was a real pleasure, incidentally. He was a wonderful, wonderful human being and a really outstanding farmer here in Nebraska. But at any rate, I did my doctoral dissertation in water law and water administration too, way back when. I would just add that what these folks have said is all correct. We've got to use water much more efficiently in agriculture than we have in the past. We're beginning to do that because people are beginning to charge more for water. We've had free water in agriculture in a lot of other places, including the urban areas, essentially free through the years, and that's not going to last any longer. And so when it has a cost, then we'll learn how to use it more efficiently. But the other thing I would add, which is a longer term element of this issue, we're going to have the research that will provide an economical way to have desalinization. In the long term, we're just not going to have enough water without that.
Yeah, which is going to require very cheap energy. That's another interesting challenge. Yeah. Mike, I know you wanted to add in.
If I were to make a suggestion to you, Ronnie, here's what I would say. We are in such a unique position here in terms of this natural resource water. For one thing, our state sits on the Ogallala Aquifer, kind of a remarkable thing. What a remarkable treasure that is to leave to the next generation. At a time when the world is scrambling to try to figure out how to utilize its water, here we have this resource here. But what I would focus on, Ronnie, is how do we protect it? How do we understand it better? How do we manage it better? Then the other thing I would say, a few weeks ago, you folks put together a drought briefing for me, and we had some of the best people in the university system around the table giving me this briefing. And I was so pleased by the quality of the people that were there and their understanding of row crop problems, range problems, just the whole gamut of drought issues. And I think whatever we can do to support those people and build that capacity will pay huge, huge dividends for our state in the future. So I think in some ways we're uniquely situated. A final thought I wanted to offer is a bit more on a global scale. You look at this massive landmass called China, and you think to yourself, well, obviously they can raise the food they need for their people. But it's not the case. Very little of China can be farmed. And the other problem is they have a terrible water problem. They do not have enough water. Their irrigation is terribly inefficient. So where are they buying their corn and soybeans? From places like Nebraska. This gives us a great opportunity if we manage this resource right, if we do the right things for the future. I just think, again, we're in a very unique position here in Nebraska to capitalize on what the good Lord has given us.
Should probably point out, and Jeff's too humble to say it, but the Water for Food Institute, the Doherty Water for Food Institute that we formed here at the university a couple of years ago, Jeff's a member of the board of that group, and that's the whole idea, is that we sit in Nebraska in a very pivotal place related to water for agriculture because of the resources we have, and understanding how we can best use those resources and sustain those resources long-term to produce more with less is the whole idea that was behind the genesis of the Water for Food Institute, Jeff.
Yeah, I think extremely important, and I think as Clayton said, when you have a price on a resource, you know, when you create economics around it, you tend to get more efficiency and effectiveness in managing the resource, and I think that's very important. In a certain sense, by the resource management discussion, we waded into the issue of how we're going to feed the world. I want to come at it from another angle, not just what are we going to do for 2050, but what are we going to do now. Given diminished corn yields at home, I know on our farm near Ashland, we had a reasonable year, but we were down 20% this year. And I think we were quite lucky as compared to many other farmers. So we've got corn yields down at home and abroad, fundamental importance that corn plays in food security. And we've got a renewable fuel standard that has led to nearly 40% of the U.S. corn crop going to ethanol. So I want to wade into the issue of should we be waiving the renewable fuel standard in a time of crisis that's shown in terms of the volatility on pricing?
Not before the election, certainly. Kind of not so kidding there, right?
I suspect President Obama's figured that out already.
You know, I would have to say that our successor in office, Secretary Vilsack, has been one of the strongest supporters of ethanol and biofuels, you know, in the country. And I don't think there's any question that, talking about biofuels for a moment, that the biofuels development has had a lot to do with the strengthened farm economy in this country overall, not just in corn, but in the other commodities as well. But, you know, does Uncle Sam need, through congressional inspiration, to mandate a certain portion of ethanol be, you know, part of our fuel supply forever and ever? No. Ought there be a time when the standard ought to be reduced and perhaps eliminated? Yes. I don't think it's quite right there yet. I don't think the industry is quite mature yet. And but you know, these subsidies in whatever form you have them shouldn't last forever. But I would have to say that we have created a remarkable industry, the biofuels industry. I mean, we've actually given ourselves an alternative for liquid fuels for transportation. We never had it before. And it wouldn't have happened without the support, the tax support, as well as the other support. I want to mention one other thing. You talked about what to do here and now. We throw away 90 billion pounds of food in the garbage every year in this country. Another thing we do is we waste enormous amounts of food in America particularly. So I think we also have to consider maybe we need some sort of a national effort to conserve the food that we actually produce, or because that's part of the whole equation as well.
Great. Some provocative thoughts there, Jack.
I think that there's a fair amount of research that would suggest that if they did lift the standard, even temporarily or however long, it's not going to change things a lot. We're still going to have a lot of ethanol produced, and it's questionable how much it'll accomplish. If they think by lifting it, all of a sudden we'll have all this corn, you're not going to. And if you did have all this corn for food, all of a sudden gasoline prices would be $6 a gallon. So, because 10% of our gasoline in our cars is ethanol. So, you know, you can't have both. So right now, yes, there's quite a bit going into the automobiles, but still, even like 40% of those bushels that go to be processed into ethanol, 40% of that comes right back in feed for livestock. So doesn't all go into the automobiles.
But I think the livestock producers might be arguing that the renewable fuel standard should be lifted, and I wonder if there is a trade-off between the $6 gasoline or the higher cost of protein in our diets.
Yeah, a little.
Well, there are trade-offs in this issue, as you well know, and it's a controversial one here in Nebraska because Nebraska has been a powerful supporter of ethanol from the very beginning. I worked on that, 40 years or more ago. And yet we have an enormous livestock industry in this country as well, which has a different view at the moment on that issue. I guess where I would come down, and fortunately, maybe I'm not the decision maker on this. Somebody else will ultimately make that decision. It seems to me that we have to be careful we don't do more harm than good by making that kind of a regulatory adjustment. The industries are already beginning to adjust to some degree to the reality that's there, and if EPA comes along now and takes an action as has been requested, we're going to add a distortion on top of a distortion, and I'm not sure we gain much by doing that. I'd be inclined to. If I were sitting in EPA, I probably would say no to that, as much as I'm sympathetic to the livestock and poultry industries.
Jack has raised a couple of valid points, as all the speakers have, but a bit of history here. There was just a few years ago, in fact, it was during the time I was governor, a product that was blended with gasoline for clean air purposes. It was called MTBE. Yep. It was banned because it started showing up in drinking water, and there was concern that it would cause cancer. And once in the drinking water, there was just no way of getting rid of it, and so state after state was banning MTBE. Our state did, as a matter of fact, again, because it was just such potential for damage. There was not a real alternative available at the time in order to meet the clean air requirements except ethanol. So the boom that you have seen in ethanol over the last few years really related to the fact that we needed a 90-10 blend of some product and gasoline to meet the clean air standards. Ethanol was the one that was there with MTBE, so they stepped in. And over the last few years, ethanol's production has ramped up to meet that 10% blend. What has happened now, ethanol is plateauing, as I predicted it would when I was Secretary of Agriculture, because we have filled that blend space. So I think, Jack, you're right. I think if you pulled that mandate down and said, let's just do away with it for a while, 6 months or whatever, or a year, I don't know that you would have much of a difference, because what's going to happen is you still need a product to blend, and ethanol is in fact that product, and ethanol is less expensive, so it's attractive to blend that product. So the economics are kind of driving this decision, and at the end of the day, that's where you stand. But if I might just add one quick thought, where we really need to be headed, and again, I know the university has been working on this, we need to go to the next generation, which is cellulosic ethanol. There will be a place for corn-based ethanol, but why not corn stover or switchgrass? We have the scientific ability to do that in the technology, but we really need to push that step, because there is a point here where we have to take some pressure off of this, or we may end up with some really bad policies here. And then, Clayton, as you point out, we'll have a distortion on a distortion, and it'll be a truly very impossible situation.
Well, I want to pivot off that, but first, Ronnie, questions from the audience. I want to check in on that.
Well, one thing that we're going to do is you're going to have the opportunity in the audience as we finish up dialogue here. If you have a question that you would like to pose to our panel tonight, there are cards that I think were distributed or are available on the floor. And if you want to write that question on a card and send it to the end of the row, there are ushers who will collect those and bring those to the stage in the latter part of our event this evening. So please, if you have questions that you would like to address to our panel, please feel free to do that, and we'll do that as we finish up our discussion.
Great. So as Ronnie said, we'd love to take your questions, so please go ahead and get them out to the aisles, and we'll work them into the dialogue. While we're waiting for the questions from the audience, I'm going to pivot to a different, really an extension of this last discussion, because that has to do with what is the appropriate policy, and I want to extend this to trade. You know, under the WTO trade regime, trade distorting subsidies for industrial goods are legally actionable. In other words, you can sue, you can take action, but that's not true for subsidies in agriculture.
Yeah.
And subsidies, many of you have talked about the importance of avoiding distortions, yet we've all been supporting a lot of subsidies that can distort the marketplace. So I want to hear your point of view. Should the two be treated differently, industrial goods versus agricultural products? If not, what is the appropriate way to get to compromises on agricultural subsidies in this country and globally?
I suppose I should start with that one, Jeff, since I've spent so many years on that issue. The fact is they should not be treated differently. A subsidy is a subsidy, and if it's distortive in the industrial area, it's distortive in agriculture too. So we basically ought to have the same rules. Most of those distortions, by the way, have worked to the disadvantage of American agriculture in the post-World War II period. So it's to our advantage to eliminate that difference and to get these subsidies moved out of the system worldwide. We'll have to do some of that here, as you point out, because we have our own subsidies, but there are a lot of them all over the world that still need to be dealt with. You have to do that at the negotiating table, of course. The World Trade Organization is the place where that has been done since it came into existence, and it was the GATT prior to that. But the problem was, and the challenge today is that agriculture wasn't even on the negotiating agenda until in the 1980s when we started the Uruguay round. In prior rounds of negotiations, nobody would even talk about agricultural distortions, and so that's why you ended up with this differentiation in the rules. So we're playing catch up with agriculture, and a lot of us have been involved in that over the last 20 or 25 years, and we're gradually making progress, but it's slow. The only other addition I would make to that is that, as many of the people in the audience know, the negotiations among the major countries of the world, 150 of them who belong to the WTO today, have been conducted in the so-called Doha round over the last 10 years. And regrettably, the Doha round has been going around in circles, spinning its wheels, getting nowhere. Around and around. And it doesn't look very optimistic. I think people would be interested to know that the European Union, which has been the major subsidizer of exports, agreed to put on the table a total phase out of those subsidies in the EU in the Doha round. But that's meaningless unless you have an agreement. The biggest action today is in the so-called Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, which are with Asia, and maybe we'll have a chance to expand on that a little bit more, but that's really important to U.S. agriculture too.
Great comment. How are we doing on questions from the audience? Are they coming our way?
There's some there, I think.
While we're waiting for questions to come up, if I could just
Sure.
Offer a thought, Clayton. I think the Uruguay round went as far as it could, and it was an important step forward in terms of distortions in agricultural trade. but there needs to be other steps.
Oh,
As you
yes.
know, it's we all worked on these issues when we were secretary, and the inability to sell our products in parts of the world was frustrating and time-consuming on our part, and progress was often measured in bits and pieces, not great jumps forward. But here's a thought I would offer, and I'm absolutely convinced of this. Having looked at agriculture worldwide, I firmly believe, I am convinced, that if we have a level playing field for American farmers and ranchers, we'll outcompete anybody. And our American farmers and ranchers will win this effort over and over again. We raise very quality products. We do it very, very efficiently. But the challenge is to get other parts of the world to step up. And I was in the WTO round, and many countries, India, Brazil, European Union, would pay lip service to this. And they would talk to the media about how willing they were to step forward. And you'd go back in the negotiating room, and it was like somebody else crawled into their skin because you got a totally different view of the world.
But you know, we're not perfect on this either.
Yeah.
Not too long ago, the WTO ruled against America on cotton subsidies in Brazil, rising out of a program that occurred at USDA when I was there. And they ruled against us.
Yes.
So in consideration of them not pressing us on a myriad of other things, we wrote a check for how much?
$146 million.
$146 million to
Brazil.
We
so
bought
they
them
wouldn't.
off.
We bought them off, so they wouldn't prosecute us for our violation of the WTO rules.
Yeah.
So I just want everybody to know that this is a real complicated issue in terms of whose ox is getting gored.
That was not our best move ever in this country.
Great. Ronnie, do you have one that you want to?
You bet. We mentioned earlier the Farm Bill. Oh, wow.
This is a good time to get into the Farm Bill.
Might
We're
want
gonna
to take
be here
those
till
to Jeff.
midnight.
And there's a question here about the Farm Bill for our panelists. We don't have a Farm Bill. We have a 6-month CR continuing resolution, and the Fiscal Cliff is coming. What do you see for the future of USDA agriculture and rural communities within that context?
I think I'm the likely suspect. Here's what I would say. The Senate has passed a farm bill. We started working on it a year and a half ago, and tremendous amount of experience on the Senate Ag Committee. We have people who have chaired that committee, been ranking member. I was Secretary of Agriculture. So our work was very businesslike and very nonpartisan, and you know, at the end of it, we got it out of committee, we sent it to the floor. It was passed with 64 votes. Would have got more, but for some pushback on peanuts and rice in the southern states, it might have gotten 70 votes. On the House side, they've got a bill out of committee, but it has not been passed on the floor yet. But I'd offer a couple of thoughts about that. Number one is I know Frank Lucas very well. He's the chair, and I know Colin Peterson. He's the ranking member and chair part of the time when I was secretary. Two good men working very hard in a very bipartisan way to put the votes together to get it done. This kind of time lag is not unusual in a farm bill. The last farm bill was actually signed in the June 18th, not signed, but approved in the June 18th of the following year. So if you put that into this time frame, we wouldn't have a farm bill until June of next year. Typically, farm bills do extend into that other year. You've mentioned the fiscal cliff. I am a member of the group of 8 senators trying to negotiate common ground to deal with the end of the year issues that we're facing, and they are huge. I offered this thought earlier today, and I will offer it today. Here's my worry about the fiscal cliff. It's not that we can't fix something that expires at the end of the year and make it retroactive. It's not that we can't pass the estate tax in January and make it retroactive to January 1. But my greatest concern is that our economic system will look at the inability to act in Congress and meet those deadlines and punish us for that. And when I say us, I mean U.S. citizens. And so it worries me as to how the marketplace would react, whether it's the price of corn, soybeans, cattle, hogs, or stocks that you have in your 401k. And that's why I am just spending all the time I have working with 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and trying to figure out, is there a way forward to solve these problems? Because if we don't solve them, I just feel that the downside for our country is great. We will pay a price for that.
Well, I think the audience is very appreciative, I know I am, of bipartisan efforts, which this country needs more of, especially right now.
Thank you.
Ronnie?
There are a whole pile here, so we're only going to get through a few
I
of
figure
them,
you're
unfortunately.
paraphrasing.
Yeah. This one relates to youth and the future of agriculture relative to our youth population. And I'll read it literally as it came in. With less kids being raised in agricultural settings, what will the education of youth about agriculture have in the role of future farm policies and the challenges of feeding the world as we've discussed them tonight?
Well, I go back to this point. If you believe that the future of agriculture economically is bright and that the farm will cash flow and the income stream is real, then a lot of this will have a spin-off impact on tax bases in states, university financing. And you see what's happened in the tech world, high-tech world, where we've created this vast infrastructure throughout this country of people knowing about and being educated in these new technologies. It just didn't happen. It happened because they were successful enterprise, and people saw that they could make a lot of money and improve lives from it. I think that's just, it's not a magic answer. Yeah, we have to continue to fund new farmer programs and do our best to ensure that kids can afford tuition in college, and that we look at our this is another issue. It has to do with our educational system as a whole, and that it's got to be resilient to produce jobs for people in the future. And it hasn't been so resilient in years past. But I do believe that if we're looking at a renaissance in agriculture, which I believe we do, then I think a lot of this will follow.
Ronnie, or Jeff, can I add a point to that?
Sure.
You know, there are not going to be as many young kids going back to the farm as was true 20 or 30 years ago. We know that because of the changes that have occurred in agriculture. But there is a great future in the agricultural food industry as a whole for the young people who are sitting out here. I mean, there are a lot of wonderful jobs in the food industry in this country, and if we continue to be a big part of the food industry worldwide, and there's no reason why we shouldn't, because we can compete in all facets of the entire food industry. So I would say to you, not all of you kids are going to be able to go back on the home farm, but boy, there are a lot of other great opportunities ahead of you, a heck of a lot more than we had when we were growing up.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think one of the important points, and one of my hopes for the future of Nebraska, is that not only will we continue to be a great production state, but that we are a center of creating agricultural intellectual property that helps to fuel agricultural productivity in other parts of the world. And I think we have a tremendous opportunity to do that.
Isn't about 15, 17% of our population is involved in the agricultural business somewhere in the system? Is that about the right percent? I mean, there's a lot of people.
Well, in this state, it's actually about 25%.
25%
It's
here.
our number one industry.
I mean, it's a huge thing, and there's a lot of opportunity. Clayton, you're right.
Yeah, and Jeff, on the international side, we might just do a little follow-up there, because as long as we do a great job competing internationally and hopefully getting closer to a level playing field, as Senator Johanns was pointing out, man, are there great possibilities there too, because international trade is such a big deal in the U.S. today, much bigger than it was when I was U.S. Trade Representative or Secretary of Agriculture. When I became USTR, I think international trade was about 11 or 12% of GDP in this country. Now it's about 30. So it's a much bigger chunk of our economy.
Go ahead, Ronnie.
Well, here's a question I know that, Jeff, you had planned in the dialogue as well. Climate change has not been mentioned much tonight. Climate change will influence water use, types of pests introduced into new regions, and may dictate the types of crops grown in the future. How does the land-grant university address this issue? What worked in the past? Will it work in the future? Or may it work in the future? So climate change and land-grant university's role in addressing potential climate change.
Well, I think one thing that, first of all, I'm a believer in climate change. I realize that it's not universally accepted. I don't know whether God's causing it or the human race is causing it. It's happening, folks. We have 3 times the forest burning up this summer than we've had in 40 years. I mean, there's just too many things, coincidence, ice cap moving back. And so whatever the cause of this is, we've got to learn to adapt to it. And I think the big role that land grants can do is to help producers adapt to changing climate.
Yes.
And that means in terms of technologies, soil management practices, water runoff related issues. I mean, adaptation seems to be the key to give people empower them to take advantage as best they can.
Ronnie, if I might hearken back to that meeting that you had where we had really, in my judgment, some of the very, very best people there talking about drought and its impact on Nebraska. One thing that was instructive to me is that when you compare what has happened to us and what a tough summer it has been to the 1950s, the graphs look similar. And I asked that question. I said, tell me, is this climate change? And the answer, no one was denying climate change. That's not what that question was about. But what they were saying is be careful about drawing conclusions. We have to get a better sense of what's happening, and it takes time to get that sense. But irregardless, ladies and gentlemen, here's what I would say. We know as a fact that as we look to our future, water is going to be a more precious resource than it's ever been. We know living out on the prairie that you're going to have years where you have plentiful rainfall and you're going to have years where you don't have much at all. We know we're going to have some very hot days and some very windy days. After all, we live on the prairie. So how do you best prepare for that? I don't see any downside in adopting a strategy that says we're going to do the right cropping practices, the right water management, the right genetics, et cetera, and let's focus on doing that because there is no downside to that. That's the right strategy under all circumstances in a state like Nebraska, and that's really where I would encourage us to be thinking and focusing.
Yeah, concur.
All I would add to that, Jeff, and I really agree totally with both Dan and Senator Johanns on this. My only additional point on that is that I think the evidence in support of something happening in the way of climate change is growing every day. And, I was a skeptic for a long time, and I'm still not. I'm like Mike. I'm not fully convinced. There could be other reasons, but my oh my, every day we're seeing more evidence, which suggests that we better be thinking about it, Ronnie, as a possible, as possibly having a major effect on American agriculture, including Nebraska agriculture in the next 20, 40, 50 years.
One of the things we've talked about this summer as we watched the drought of 2012 unfold, and I think, Senator, when you were referring to that group, we talked a little bit about this that day. The technologies that we have available today that we didn't have available in the 1930s have changed the face of what this drought has looked like, if you really think about it. What the outcome will be this year as compared to what it would have been 75 years ago, in the way that it occurred then. So we've got a lot of learning to do, even from this drought, and what that's going to tell us about our technologies and the advances in those technologies. I had a real interesting question come in. There's a bunch of interesting ones in here. I'm sorry we don't have time to cover them all. But this one relates to the role of women. And the question was, what's your view on the role that women will play in the Feeding the World challenge ahead?
Well, because there is an absence of them on this panel, we may not be the best people, but I would have to say globally, women are the prime determiner of whether, for example, sub-Saharan Africa pulls itself out of the agricultural situation they're currently in, because I think 70% of the smallholder farmers are
That's
women.
right, 70% of farm labor in Africa is women.
And so internationally and globally, women are really critical for the future of food production.
Right. The other point I'll just add, since I spend a lot of time on this issue, is not only are they a very important part of the farming in places like sub-Saharan Africa, but also when the women control the agricultural output, it tends to go into a little bit of extra income to get the kids educated, to have food security, to deal with the health interventions. And so it's certainly our view at the Gates Foundation that one of the most important things we can do is have a clear-cut gender strategy as part of our agricultural development work. Mike?
You know, you're absolutely right. We visited a tiny little farm in Africa, and Melinda Gates was there with us. And this small farming operation was being led by the woman, by the wife. And when she talked about the difference that genetics were making because their corn production had been better, they call it maize there, she pointed to the fact that now she had extra money so her kids could go to school. So the benefits you see is not just in terms of the day-to-day living of that family, it's the fact that all of a sudden you're going to have family members that are now educated better than the last generation. The last thing I'll tell you about women in agriculture, I grew up on a dairy farm, and every single morning when those cows needed to be milked, there were two people in the barn first, my father and my mother, and they worked side by side their whole life. And it never occurred to me that there was a gender difference in agriculture. She worked as hard as he did. So.
My sister Mary Jo's out there. We did the eggs together. Yeah.
Just a quick additional point. Not only are women really good workers, as we've all discovered all around the world, but they also have leadership capabilities.
Absolutely.
And for a long time, we ignored all that. As you know, I've had the privilege of sitting on a lot of corporate boards through the years. And when I first started doing that, 20 years or so ago, there were no women on corporate boards in this country. Then they began to have one on. And now what has happened is those boards have discovered, hey, those women members are as good or better than we are. And the same thing in being CEOs of companies.
Yeah, very much agree. Ronnie, I don't know if there's any question about labor in the immigration sense, but if you don't mind, I might wade into that because I love these controversial topics. The question I really have is I know a lot of farmers who feel a very strong dependence on labor that represents immigration. Yet we have a real attitude in this country that in some segments of the population that is very against immigrant labor. So I'd love to hear the points of view of the panelists relative to immigration and agriculture. Go ahead, Jack.
Well, I would just say, if we're going to stand up for agriculture, we have to support the idea that we're going to need a lot of labor, individuals that are willing to butcher the hogs and pick the strawberries and do a lot of very hard work, even constructing buildings. And there's a lot of things. We cannot find people to do the work unless they are immigrants or whether they're legal or illegal. So we need to find a way to make sure we have them to grow our country and produce the food, whatever we need. It's as simple as that, and somehow we're not going to send 12 million people back to Mexico or wherever. They're going to be around. We just need to make things work out some way, and I hope the two parties can come together on it.
And I would just say that I agree with Jack, but the political rhetoric this year on immigration is just atrocious. And I'm going to try my best not to be overly political about this, but if you listen to many in this political era we're in, people have forgotten that this country was founded by immigrants. Yes. Everybody here came through some way, largely because they were looking for a better life. And we've got to get off, as Jack said, the politicization of this issue. And agriculture is probably utilizes immigrant labor more than any other industry in America. We've got to find a way to do it a fair way, treat people fairly so they're not abused in the process, and it can be done. This is not an impossible thing to do.
Two quick comments. One is that there is no reason why we should not be able to have an effective guest worker program, if we call it that, in agriculture. There's just no reason why that should not be able to be accomplished. The second one, the argument against this that's made by a lot of people is that, if people just raise the income or the earnings levels a little bit, the wage rates, Americans will fill those jobs. Well, that may be true, but I can give you one specific example on that, Jeff, and that was an entity out west, a farm operation, that invited 300 job openings for which they invited people to apply. Not one single American applied.
Senator?
Yes.
We tried to save you.
Yes.
We knew you'd want to have the last word on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's what I would offer. All of us can relate to the story I'm going to tell. My grandparents on my mother's side immigrated from Poland, spoke English, but spoke Polish. When they wanted to say something that my mother couldn't understand, they'd speak in Polish, and I'll never forget, she'd say, speak in English, speak in English. My grandmother, to the day of her death, prayed out of a Catholic Polish prayer book. It was in Polish. My point is this: we in this nation celebrate and welcome legal immigration. We have no problem with that in this country. Look around this room. We all came from immigrants. That's not the difficulty here. But what we ended up with as a national system is very, very broken, and it's not working. We have people that literally would come here from other parts of the world and do high-tech jobs, everything from that to milking cows and picking berries or whatever, but we don't have a system in place to deal with that. And we have this arcane system of a certain number, and it's broken and it's not working. And so what happened over the years? The borders kind of burst open, and now all of a sudden you've got these issues to deal with. Here's what I would say. I think if we can ever get to a point where we can convince people that, yes, in fact, we are protecting our borders, because that's important. No country can exist without safe borders. And number two, that we have an immigration system that is working, that is operating fairly, that doesn't allow people to jump to the front of the line, then I think we'll have the right combination and we can get a bipartisan agreement on immigration. But that's what it's going to take, because the American people, we are raised to believe you honor the law, you obey the law, and to set up a system where people feel that we are waiving that or ignoring it won't work. Not in this country.
So, Jeff, there are a couple of burning questions out of this pile that recurred in a number of submissions that we don't want to miss. One relates to the livestock industry. And of course, there's been a lot of discussion, as we know, about the livestock industry and potential regulation of the livestock industry around animal rights, animal welfare in particular. And I guess I would summarize a number of the questions that came into the pile here as, are you concerned about the livestock industry's costs being raised in a way that it might be shipped offshore in the U.S.?
That's the risk. The risk is if there's enough pressure on it, and the pressure comes in two different ways. One way is that you have the animal rights organizations complaining and, raising a fuss about it. Some of it's true and some of it's, over the top. And certainly every operation, every livestock operator doesn't do a great job. Some are not, but there's every incentive for farmers to do a good job, take care of their livestock, keep them happy. That's how they'll grow and get ready and go to market in a good time. You're not going to have any luck raising animals if you don't take care of them right. But you got to deal with the animal rights people and try to get the message out and get a good job done. The risk is if they are able to get the federal government to start writing laws telling the industry how to do this and how to do that. If you get the federal government into this, then we got real problems. And you got to worry about states like California, maybe that state's already in it. So I just think the government side of it's what I worry more about than just the pressure that might be put on by these animal rights groups. That's my thoughts.
And another one. This is we're going to go to maybe a less controversial.
None of us.
Well said.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. That's the right answer.
Yeah.
I think that's a pro vote.
So the last one goes back to our Morrill Act and land-grant university discussion tonight. And the question, I'll read it literally to you here. If agricultural research is going to be important to meet the challenges that we've talked about tonight, why does USDA research get funded significantly less than the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation?
It's a good question. Why does the NIH get a budget that's 20 times bigger, I think, than the agriculture research budget? Well, part of that is because everybody is going to get a disease, get sick, and die. So they see the relevance to their lives. Let's be honest about it.
Dan wants to end on a positive note.
No. So here's the point. It's no secret why the National Cancer Institute and the Heart and Blood Institute and all these institutes do very well, because they're working on cures for disease that affect you and your children and your families, and it's impactful. You feel it, and the Pentagon, of course, gets whatever they want for most research. You just in fact, we ought to put the Agricultural Research Service in the Pentagon, and then it would get 10 times what it's getting right now, probably. I don't know, but that's over the top, probably. So one of the things we have to do is we have to be able to not only make the research relevant to the public as a whole, which I think it is, but it's got to be sold to the public as relevant to their lives. And more, especially when we talk about the issues about feeding the world in a hungry way, first time in ever, we had these multilateral talks, and food security and agriculture was a part of them. It's called the G8 and the G20. They'd never been there before. One of it is because people are starting to realize this is important stuff, okay? So I think the land-grant community, the food and agriculture community has to work with others, not just talk to ourselves, but work with people in the health community and the business community and the national security community to state the case that this is important to people's lives. And if people recognize it, then they'll get a higher degree of attention than they do right now. That's how I see the subject.
But
And
can I add a quick
Clayton,
comment?
go ahead.
You know, one of the problems there is that this is a discretionary item in the U.S. budget. And when we get into a situation like we have today with deficits and debt problems that are just a monumental size, all discretionary spending gets shrunk. And maybe ours gets shrunk more than the NIH. But what that means is that, boy, priority determinations become more and more important than ever before. And we in agriculture just have to do the very best job we possibly can in trying to get these kinds of priorities high on the federal priority scale.
There was one last question that I want to ask the group. There are a lot of students here tonight, and we're very pleased about that. There are a lot more students becoming interested in agriculture and the food system in the last number of years, and we're certainly experiencing that here at the University of Nebraska. We're kind of in a time of prosperity in a lot of ways, accepting the drought conditions this year. We've had a number of good years in agriculture recently. And here in Nebraska, we certainly know that that's helped our economy substantially, and we've enjoyed the benefits of that, especially during the economic downturn that the rest of the world has been experiencing. For the benefit of the youth in the audience, how long do you think that's going to last? You know, we've enjoyed that. So what's your prediction for the future of agriculture from that perspective?
All of us who have been Secretary of Agriculture will run into people, and you've run into this question. Mike, what will the price of corn be in December? And it's, I always say, you know, if I knew, I'd be trading corn futures instead of doing what I do. But here's what I would say. I think the future is very bright. Another thought for the young people, you know, I remember that pledge we used to say, I believe in the future of farming. I think it's now, I believe in the future of agriculture. On a very personal level, I love agriculture. I love big agriculture. I love small agriculture. I love all sizes in between. It is a passion of mine. When I work on agricultural issues, I remember where I grew up. I remember the steady upbringing that I got from two wonderful parents. And all I would say to you is don't necessarily worry so much about whether you're going to make multi-millions of dollars. Do it because you love it, because it's your passion, and I promise you the rest of it will take care of itself. And besides that, it's kind of like my father always used to say, if you love what you're doing, if you love your job, you'll never work a day in your life. And that's so true. Just do what you love, and if you believe in it and love it, do it. Find your place, and you're going to have a great life.
Concur. I just want, in addition to that, I would have to say that the fundamentals look very good.
Yes, they
so
do.
Beyond having the passion, you still have to look at the economics and the realities of the fundamentals. And if I'm out there looking at things in the world that are going to be future-oriented things, I would certainly look at this industry because the fundamentals are outstanding.
Yeah.
Just a quick addition to that, and that is that, you know, agriculture is going to have its ups and downs. It's never going to be a straight road up as it looks like it might be right at the moment. So we're going to have some adjustments as we go along. That's happened for the last 200 years in this country, and it's going to continue in the next 200. But I think what gives an advantage to people in Nebraska and the kinds of folks who are sitting in this audience tonight is we've got a work ethic and a value structure that's as good and as solid as you'll see anywhere in the world. And as long as that continues, and I see no reason why it shouldn't continue forevermore, Nebraska's going to do just fine.
Yeah.
Jeff?
I say amen.
Go ahead, Jack.
I amen to what they said. They're right.
And Kansas too, by the way.
Yeah.
Just not Nebraska.
Kansas too.
Well, I know Ronnie wants to close, but I want to say thank you all very much. I think part of what gives me great optimism about the future of agriculture is the kind of vision that you have each shared, and I know that that can be magnified by using your voice. So we had that opportunity to use your voice some tonight. I hope we get the opportunity to use your voice more in the future. So thank you very much.
Dan, that was fun.
It's always good being
Jack.
Hey, my friend.
We have a tradition
Mike, good job.
in the
Thank
Heuermann
you.
Lectures that we started
that's way
last
better.
year with a full year of lectures of presenting the lecturers who we invite to our campus from around the world a medal that is in honor of the Heuermann Lecture series. And you see a picture of that medal on the screen before you tonight. Depicts the theme of the lectures around food and natural resource and community and people security in the food system. And I'm very pleased tonight to present one of those medals to our 4 former Secretaries of Agriculture and to Jeff Rakes, who's done such a wonderful job moderating this discussion tonight. Please join me again in thanking them for a wonderful lecture this evening.